Hello, everybody. This is a review video for the final exam for Math 100, Liberal Arts Mathematics. Okay, so what you see on the screen is the practice for the final exam, and I believe it is already available through your Canvas site or Canvas shell, and hopefully you have the ideal way to do this is for you to try all these problems, okay, and then on your own, maybe looking up some notes or the book or whatever, and then come back and answer these questions. Come back and look up these answers, or maybe to have the video try to explain the parts that you did not understand in the first place, or maybe to check your answers. Also, the written PDF file, the answer key should be already available through your Canvas shell as well. So perhaps the way you want to use this video is to just pinpoint or focus on the parts that you couldn't quite understand even when you looked up the answers. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. I plan to go over all the problems along with some comments. So if you want to watch this in your entirety, that's fine too, because I will be making some comments and hints on maybe extra things that it may not be available on the written answer key. Okay, so let's get started here. You should have your calculator when you are taking your exam, and also while you do this final exam, the prep. Okay, so here's the first question. What is the negation of the statement, no one is practicing social distance? I will be both writing on the screen and typing on the screen as well, because for some of these, especially the first questions, it is quicker to type my answers here. Okay. All right, so what's the negation of the statement, no one is practicing social distancing? Right. So the answer is, notice here, okay, so this says no one is practicing social distance. It's a universal negative quantifier. And of course, you don't need to know that if you can just come up with the answer, but the answer has to be existential. Okay, so some, or there exists at least one person. That's a very precise way of saying some actually do. So the opposite of no one is practicing is that some are practicing. Some are practicing social distancing. Okay. More technically, if you really want to make this precise, a precise logical or mathematical statement, you can say there exists, man, that sounds really fancy. There exists at least one person practicing social distancing. That would be the correct negation. All right, again, the negation of no one is practicing social distancing is not everyone is practicing social distance. You don't have to prove that. In order to negate this claim, no one is practicing social distancing, all you need to provide is one counterexample, namely at least one person practicing social distancing. All right, so that's number one. Okay, number two is kind of a big a problem, because you have to give several answers here, right? And let's see if I can come up with a box. All right, so write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the statement. If you are arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter the United States, right? So if P, then Q is the statement. It's called a conditional statement. And the converse is to switch the P and Q. Now, notice, remember, whenever you write these statements, do not put the word if in the middle. Now, in English, you can do that, okay? So the statement you have now is, if you are arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter the US. If you switch the conditional clause and the main clause like this, you cannot enter the US if you are arriving from Brazil. Notice there, the sentence really didn't change at all, okay? So the meaning-wise, if you switch the two parts, if you cannot enter, let's see, what does it say? You cannot enter the US if you are arriving from Brazil. That would not be the converse, okay? So in order to write the inverse, converse, and contrapositive, you must, or you should, start every one of those with the word if. In other words, we assume that you will write the conditional statement first. That's how it works in logic. If P, then Q. That's the convention. That's the form that we will use. So when we say in the converse, we switch the order. So basically, what you have to do is to say if Q, then P. All right. So what does that mean in this case? It means if you cannot enter the U.S., then you must be, or you are arriving from Brazil. That's the converse, okay? If you cannot enter the US, then you are arriving from Brazil. Notice here I have switched the antecedent with the consequent, or the hypothesis with the conclusion, okay? That is called the converse. All right, and then what's the next one that we are supposed to find, right? Inverse, okay? Inverse is obtained by not switching, but negating each of these statements. So if you are not arriving from Brazil, then you, so here you have to negate the word you cannot, the cannot, okay? So if you negate the negation, of course you get the positive side, which is you can enter the US. Okay, so that would be the inverse of the statement. If you are not arriving from Brazil, then you can enter the US. All right, now I have to stop here and tell you something. Neither of these is actually logically equivalent to the statement, if you are arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter the US. All right, so let me explain what I mean by this. I hope you are paying close attention to this. And I mean, this is true just in general, okay, in life. Right? Let's say the government actually did tell you, which you know, they could be at any time, if you're arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter the United States, okay? So that's a declarative statement, and that's a conditional statement. Now, it's possible that there may be other places from which, if you're coming, you cannot enter. Let's say this ban is applicable to other places like Argentina or China or an African country or an Asian, you know, whatever, okay? So it may be that Brazil could be one of the many multiple countries where if you're arriving from there, you cannot enter, okay? Now, the statement, if you are arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter the US, that's still a true statement. But if you're from other countries, you may not be able to enter. So it is not correct to say, if you cannot enter from the US, you must be arriving from Brazil. So the converse is not equivalent to the original statement. The inverse is not either, because the inverse will claim if you are not arriving from Brazil, then you can enter the US. They never told you that, okay? They never told you that Brazil is the only country where if you're from there, you cannot enter, right? But what is logically equivalent to the original statement is this last one, contrapositive. This is the only one that is equivalent, logically equivalent to the statement, original statement, if you're arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter the US. So the contrapositive is to do exactly both of those, okay? So you switch the order and you negate. Right? So it'll be in the structure, if not P, then, if not Q, then not P. In English here, it'll say if you can, all right, so negate the negation, cannot. So if you can enter the US, then you are not arriving from Brazil. Notice here, that is a true statement if the original statement is true. Okay, in the original statement, they're saying if you are arriving from Brazil, you cannot enter. So if you are able to, or if you can enter the US, okay, that means the first condition must not apply. In other words, you must not be arriving from Brazil, because if you were, then you would not be allowed to enter the US. Okay, so the last part, which is logically equivalent, the contrapositive is the only one equivalent, I mean logically equivalent to the original statement. All the other ones are not logically equivalent. All right, so the next one, I guess I should write, yeah, I mean, just jot down the information. And so